Hello and welcome to this live question and answer session with the two keynote speakers for our online conference on the topic of supporting learners' emotional health and well-being. My name is Paul Ellis. I'm Head of Teaching and Learning at Cambridge International. I'll be facilitating this session with Julie Reid, one of our education managers. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
We're delighted to be joined by the presenters of the two keynotes that you have already had the opportunity to view. Professor David Putwain from Liverpool John Moores University, a specialist in motivation, emotion, engagement, the learning environment and test anxiety is the first one. So welcome, Dave.
Yeah, hello everybody.
And secondly, Dr. Ros McClellan from the University of Cambridge, specialist in achievement, motivation, maths, anxiety, wellbeing, creativity, many other things. Welcome, Ros.
Hello, everyone.
So in the first half of this 60-minute session, Julie and I are going to be asking Ros and David some questions to underline and expand on some of the key themes that they talked about in their presentations. And while we're doing so, we'd like you to engage and interact using the Q&A function on Zoom to give your comments and opinions, and above all, to send us your own questions that we can ask on your behalf in the second half hour. You can indicate whether you like someone else's question, and our aim is to ask David and Ros the questions that are the most popular. So as ever, keep your questions specific to today's topic, but also general enough to be of interest to everyone who's tuning in. And thank you in advance for all the questions that you put there. We've chosen the theme of supporting learners' emotional health and well-being to explore how we can create opportunities for students to perform to the best of their ability. What are some of the barriers and challenges that they are encountering? What is interfering with their potential? Interference comes in all shapes and sizes, and it's not always easy to see what's getting in the way. And this is especially true of interference related to mental health and well-being. We hear these words a lot, but do we know what they mean so that we can support our learners throughout their education? As we learned from Ros's and David's presentations, education is not just about achievement, but also about how we feel and function, not only now, but for the long term as well. Our focus in this session is above all on mental health, well-being, stress and anxiety in teaching, learning and assessments, not only for learners, but also for teachers. Okay, so we thought it would be useful to begin with a reminder of some of the key terms. So Ros, I'm going to ask you the first question, if that's okay. And it's sort of a general question really, but just to help us define these terms. So people often talk about mental health and well-being as though it's one word and all exactly the same thing. But in brief, and I know you've already done this in the presentation, but for those who are tuning in and may not have quite gathered all the information or haven't had the chance to look at the presentations yet, how would you describe and distinguish the terms mental health and well-being?
It's important perhaps to think of them as slightly separate things. So mental health is you can be mentally unwell or mentally healthy, but mental well-being, you can be flourishing or not flourishing. So, you know, they are slightly separate. We should be very concerned obviously about people who have mental illnesses, but well-being may be a slightly separate issue.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the word flourishing there. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about flourishing. I know you presented this nice graph in your presentation, but what does to be flourishing actually mean in your mind?
Well, it's someone who really is doing well, they're getting on, they're capable of tackling challenges, they're self-actualizing, fulfilling potential and generally doing well.
Great, thank you. So that's a nice brief start to what these terms are. I'm going to ask Dave now for similar sorts of things as well. David, you talked a lot about stress and anxiety in your presentation. I was wondering if you could define a bit more for us what you think stress is and what you think anxiety is.
Thanks, Paul. That's a good question because people often use the terms interchangeably in their sort of everyday life. Some people, might say I'm feeling stressed when actually they mean they feel anxious because they're using the terms interchangeably. So it's important to try and pin down exactly what the differences are. And in a nutshell, stress can be a positive thing sometimes. Stress can push people, can motivate people, people can perform better under a bit of stress. But equally, for other people, stress can be a negative thing. Stress can become overwhelming and stress can become debilitating. And when we're talking about anxiety, what we're specifically referring to is a negative response to stress. It's not the only negative response to stress, but it's a very sort of particular, clearly defined negative response to pressures. And when we're talking about test anxiety specifically, then the pressures are those that come with exams and performance and other forms of assessment as well.
Great, thank you.
So we'd also just like to think a little bit more about prevalence, and just to delve a little bit deeper into some of the statistics. I mean, for example, Ros, you mentioned in your presentation that I think 1 in 6 people may have probable mental health problems. We just want to think about it in terms of, are you seeing any particular trends with children and young people with regards to well-being?
Yes, I mean, there's quite a lot of research looking at different groups of young people. So, for instance, adolescent girls tend to have worse well-being than adolescent boys. It tends to get worse as you go through adolescence. Certain groups in society, so those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, tend to have lower well-being than those who are from more privileged backgrounds. So there is quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't affect, people's well-being differs by group they're part of.
Okay. And also thinking about, I mean, do you think that maybe children are more anxious nowadays? Or is it a case of, we're talking about it more and maybe they're more willing to come forward and to talk about these kinds of issues?
There may be some elements of that, but I do think that there is actually an increase in the difficulties young people are facing. So the study you mentioned at the beginning, which is an NHS survey, National Health Service here in Britain, they had done a similar survey about 3 years ago where the figure was 1 in 9 rather than 1 in 6, looking at well-being specifically in something called the Good Childhood Report, which is an annual survey here in the UK. The prevalence of low well-being went up from 10, 12% to about 18% in the last year, partly to the pandemic. So I think there is an element of the issue may be growing because of the stresses of modern living. But obviously there is an element of people being more willing to come forward as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And David, have you got anything to contribute to that? Maybe thinking about test anxiety as well.
Sure. This is perhaps no surprise, but test anxiety tends to be the most prevalent around the times when adolescents are doing high stakes exams. So, data from the UK shows, or when I say the UK, specifically England, that around the period when students are studying for and taking their GCSEs and A-levels, so we're talking about the ages of approximately 14 to 19, we're finding between 20 to 30% of girls are reporting high levels of test anxiety, and approximately 6 to 12% of boys reporting high levels of test anxiety. So it's interesting, Ros, that gender difference that you find in the mental health and wellbeing data is also seen in the test anxiety data. But there's far, far less difference in test anxiety between people who come from wealthy and non-wealthy backgrounds. The influence of economic disadvantage on test anxiety is very, very, very small.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. And also as well, just start to think about maybe some of the practical approaches then. We have a lot of teachers listening to this, and you shared, both of you shared some really useful strategies in your presentations around test anxiety and well-being. And I'd just like to explore those maybe a bit further with, I say, what teachers can do on a practical level. So really my first question around that is, how as a classroom teacher, do you identify learners who may be having problems? I mean, for example, are there any particular indicators to look out for? Maybe Ros, if we come to you first for that one.
Yeah, so if we're talking about mental health illness, I think the main thing is if you notice a change in a young person, and teachers are really well placed because they often know the young people well. So, if someone is developing depression or anxiety at a clinical level where they do need some specialist support, you might well notice they become withdrawn, or they may not be engaging with their schoolwork, or they may not be talking to their friends. So small subtle changes can be quite important to follow up on. But in terms of well-being, I think it's similar. It is about relationships and getting to know your students. And of course, many teachers really, you're seeing your students every day. You do see them, so you can notice these changes and talk to them about it and see what's sitting behind them. I mean, shouldn't leap to an immediate assumption. There can be lots of little things, because well-being and happiness fluctuates for all of us over the day, and that's not at all a worry. It's very normal. But if you're noticing a longer-term trends, then yes, you should be worried. There is some research evidence that suggests that actually, if you're not worried about, as a teacher, if you're not worried about a child, chances are they are actually fine. I think something like this was a study from 2020 suggested of teachers saying they weren't worried about children, only 5% actually did have underlying problems. Be reassured. If you think your students are fine, they probably are fine. It's actually a little bit more difficult to spot the problem, I guess.
It was interesting there, actually, when you were saying about seeing your students every day, because we were talking a bit about this as well. I mean, currently at the moment, a lot of people are conducting lessons online. So do you think there may be some difficulties there, identifying maybe if you're teaching a lesson and your students have their cameras off, whether that's a bit more difficult for teachers to identify those students?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it is that this whole year has been very difficult for teachers, and this whole camera on and camera off, and the privacy elements is very difficult to deal with as a teacher. And you have to find the ways you can to develop the relationships through non-verbal ways, the chat functions, and keeping in touch with the class. But I'm not underestimating how difficult it has been for the profession this year.
Okay, thank you for that. David, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. I've listed some of the signs of test anxiety on slide 50 in the combined pack. So if anybody wants to refer to these, they can do. And what we've got for test anxiety is test anxiety related thoughts, for instance, feeling not in control, sense of being overwhelmed. We've got test anxious feelings, the affective component, so feelings of panic, worrying, and so on. We've got a physiological element to it, churning stomach and heart beating really fast and getting dizzy and so on. And we've also got a behavioural element to it as well, which is quite similar to what Ros described as well. So test anxiety can manifest through procrastination in exam preparation, withdrawal from effort, disengagement in classes, and that's because we tend to try and avoid the things we fear. And if failure is the thing that you fear, then, actually engaging in work actually becomes a difficult thing to do. And I'd also concur with what Ros said about getting to know your students, because anxiety is a private experience. I mean, sometimes it can manifest very, very obviously if a student's having, a very obvious panic attack. But quite often these things go on internally, and people quite often go to some great lengths to hide them as well, because they don't want to be seen to be anxious. So it's a very private experience. And obviously, the better you get to know somebody, the more likely you are to be able to spot when they're feeling anxious, or the more likely they are to tell you when they're feeling anxious. But one of the things I'd always encourage teachers to do in their classes and their schools is to, undertake a very straightforward screening questionnaire with students, which can be a very easy and straightforward approach to trying to get a sense of who's high in test anxiety and not. And I've never been surprised when I've done this with a school and presented them with a list of students, because they go through and they go, yeah, oh, I never would have thought that person, and that's because they've just never disclosed to anybody. They've never told anybody about it. They think they're the only one. So yeah, I'd always encourage, there's various free measures in which people can do this. So I'd always encourage teachers, because there'll always be people who've hidden under the radar, that won't be obvious to spot.
I think the main thing, just to follow up on what you were saying, Dave, which I totally agree with, is sometimes it's not obvious, you know, so there has to be a conversation. So what we probably have to do as teachers is empower our young people to explain to them this process, that it is normal to feel these things, and to know to flag it up if it's starting to become a problem. And I understand that's easier said than done, but it is about, you know, education is power, is it not?
So we're talking about a lot of things that people could do. Sorry, Dave. Sorry, to of you.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, Ross. The palpable sense of relief I have had from students when you tell them they're not the only one, you know, is incredible. It's very difficult to describe. It can be quite moving. You know, it's like you can see a weight coming off their chest. So although it's easier said than done, there's an awful lot of benefits that come from it, I think.
So the flip side of saying things which a teacher should do, there are of course some things a teacher shouldn't do. And I remember reading somewhere, I don't know whether you might each have contributed this in some of this report that was done by the exams regulator in the UK that talked about something called fear appeals, where people make appeals which can actually create fear in the students. So that could come from parents or from teachers or from other people as well, which can be off-putting. Although of course you can also have positive appeals where you really I don't know, talk excitedly about a subject and it really makes people want to do more of it. I was just wondering if you wanted to say more about fear appeals and also anything else that perhaps we ought to be a bit aware of that we might not necessarily think about or reflect on, that we habitually do as teachers that we perhaps ought to avoid. I don't know, as David, you want to start on that one?
Sure. So when we're talking about fear appeal, you know, we're essentially talking about the types of messages that you see everywhere in everyday life. You know, don't drink and drive because this is the negative outcome. Don't smoke, this is the negative outcome. If you don't work hard for your exams, this is the negative outcome. And, you know, a positive message might be you need to work hard in order to get the positive outcome. What we've actually seen in a lot of the research actually is it doesn't really matter whether the message is, when it comes to exams, that is, the message is positive or negative. It doesn't really matter whether a teacher is saying, if you don't work hard, you're going to fail, or you need to work hard in order to pass, because they're two sides of the same coin. What's really important is how the student interprets that message, how they evaluate that message, how they respond to that message. And in some ways, it comes down to that positive negative stress thing that we touched on earlier. So, you know, reminding students of the consequences of their exams. You know, if you want to get a good job, you've got to do well. If you want to go to college, university, you've got to do well. If you want to make something of your life, you've got to do well. Quite often, all these messages are absolutely correct, you know. But they're a source of pressure on the student. And, you know, when these things are important to the student, when they want to go to college, you know, when they want to aspire to a particular job and so on and so on, you know, then they listen to that message readily. Not all students, some students just ignore it, but those students for whom that is relevant listen to it. And those who interpret that message positively, you know, positive stress, they actually respond well to those messages. And they'll tell you they like those messages, they liked hearing them, it gave them an impetus to try harder, do more work. But the flip side is for those students who respond negatively to them, those students who respond badly to them, who develop test anxiety as a result of it, has the opposite effect. So it's a very, very, very tricky thing to try and work out and determine which students are going to respond well and which aren't. So what I'd say is, if you use those messages with a whole class or a whole school or a whole year cohort, inevitably there's going to be some who respond well and some who don't. If you're going to use them at all, try and direct them towards individuals or small groups. But, you know, please give some thought as to whether that individual is the one who responds to a bit of, I don't know whether this is an English idiom. You know, we talk about carrot and stick. You know, stick is to beat people along and carrot is to kind of egg them along. You know, work out who responds best to the carrot and the stick and use appropriately accordingly.
And that's important. So it's not a general thing. You do need to look at individual students as well as part of this. But then again, they're likely to be the carrot or the stick people, perhaps. Or of course, that can change in time as well. So I don't know, it sounds complicated, but in actual fact, it's not necessarily, because I think you can group students fairly well, at least in a period of time, can't you?
I'd say it's, I mean, you know, I know this is a slight segue into the motivation field, but there is something called the expectancy value theory of motivation. So you've got to think about what people value, and value has there are different types of values, whether it's instrumental or it's, you know, something intrinsic or so forth. So this, to go back to what Dave was saying, is you have to know your students, to know what they value, where they want to go, and build and work with them on that so they can get to the goals they want. So yes, I'd avoid peer appeals. I don't think on the whole that's a good idea. You need to start with a more neutral conversation about, well, where are you trying to go? What do you want to do? What are your inner dreams? You know, and have an open conversation. And actually,
listening to the
having
that
well. Across the desk is not a good thing either. You know, it's best to be sitting at a slight angle so you're not staring into young people's eyes, because, you know, the power differential there is quite difficult perhaps for young people to deal with. So you've got to think of all these non-verbal messages you might be sending as a practitioner.
Absolutely.
Okay, and just thinking about what you were talking about there as well, to what extent should we be focusing on sort of prevention rather than cure? So it's about knowing your students as well. I mean, are there interventions that we should maybe be thinking about at primary school level, for example? Things that we can be doing at that stage to kind of lay the groundwork?
Absolutely. Definitely. I mean, you know, I think there's two things going on. You know, we have young people who who have problems and desperately need some professional support, but they're a fairly small number. But to avoid them becoming at risk of developing some of those clinical level problems such as depression and anxiety, there is lots we can do that can stop them falling into that area. So, you know, we need sort of an approach which is to support everyone, but then also have approaches that support those individuals that need specialist support. So I'd say, you know, there are universal types of approaches that schools should be doing. In the UK, you know, there's been a long history of social and emotional programs in schools such as SEAL. What they call CEL approaches internationally in America have also been quite big. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence. There's been a number of meta-analyses that demonstrate they do have moderate impacts. So I think we should be going for these sorts of approaches. And it's the sorts of things we were talking to, both Dave and I were talking about in terms of tackling the classroom, working on relationships, looking at goals and values, as we've already talked about. You know, it's none of it's what I'd call rocket science, but it has an important place. And I think where it may fall down is when practitioners, perhaps particularly secondary practitioners, see themselves as geographers or mathematicians or so forth, and don't understand that this is really also a very important part of the role. It's not just about getting across your subject knowledge. Being a teacher is, I'm sure, you know, people understand this. It's a much broader role than that. So you need to be thinking about these things too. So where things get bolted on as an extra, they don't tend to work so well. It has to be, in my view, permeating the whole school and its ethos.
Yeah, more integral. Yeah. A question for you, which comes to us quite often, is about stress potentially actually being good for you. And I know that David, you already touched on this, something when you were describing what stress is, but here's just an open question. I'll start with you, David, on this one, and maybe Ross, you want to pick up on where Dave finishes. Is to what extent is a bit of stress good for you?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's another really important question to ask. There seems to be a quite commonly held view that a bit of stress is good for you, and then, you know, you reach almost like an optimum level of performance with a moderate level of stress, and then when stress gets too great, your performance starts to drop off. So you end up with what looks like a U-shaped curve if you're going to, you know, graph the relationship between stress and performance. And you know, this idea took hold in the 1950s. And I'm sorry, but there's absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. It's a total myth. Because as I've been sort of emphasizing up till now, it's not so much the amount of stress, it's the type of stress. And when I say the type of stress, you know, the response to that stress. You know, if students are having a negative reaction to stress, a little bit of it is not very negative, but it's still negative. And the more stress you get, the more negative that response is. And if a student's having a positive response to stress, a little bit of stress is a little bit positive. And then the more stress they have, then it becomes a bit more positive, and then it sort of evens out. So the answer is a little bit of stress a good thing? Well, it depends. It can be both. It's important to distinguish between a student's reaction and response to stress. Whether, I mean, we've been talking about positive and negative, you know, the actual technical terms are a challenge state versus a threat state. And having said that, it's also important to differentiate between chronic stress and the kind of short-term stress people can be under. Chronic stress, even when it's positive or a challenge state, is almost universally negative. It can be positive, but when people are subjected to that stress for a long period of time, and you know, the usual outcome is burnout and exhaustion. So it's important to also make a distinction not only between the type of stress, but also whether that stress is kind of, you know, the short-term stress people can be under when preparing for an exam versus, you know, chronic stress over an extended period of time.
Thank you. Ros, anything else on that?
No, I totally agree with Dave, and you know, this is his research area, so I absolutely would go with what he says on this.
Great, thank you. Wondering as well about different subject areas. Looking at well, actually some things you said in your presentation as well, and we've had other conversations around this, where there might be certain subject areas and indeed assessments in certain subject areas that are more stressful than in others. I'm not going to give any specific examples here because I'll let you do that, but are there certain subjects where you've seen that I don't know, there's greater well-being or there's greater anxiety or less of each of those? Maybe Ros, if I start with you on this one.
Well, yes, I think there is. I mean, in terms of, I did some work for Creative Partnerships, which was a scheme in the UK bringing in practitioners, creative practitioners into schools. So this wasn't just artists, painters, it was filmmakers and so forth. And we looked at whether their work in subjects actually promoted well-being or not. And there was a slight overall effect, but there is other work in the field that looks at what the creative arts in particular can offer in terms of well-being. And, you know, if well-being is around, you know, relatedness, autonomy and competence needs being fulfilled, in the creative arts in particular, there is great scope for that, which has published a paper in that area with one of my doctoral students, which shows some clear evidence of that. So I think there is scope in particular subject areas for it, more evidently due to the type of work they're doing in those subjects. But that's not to say these principles aren't at all transferable to other subject areas. So, you know, I'm not suggesting if you're, I used to teach maths myself in secondary school, so it's not like you can't promote well-being in maths. We absolutely can. So please don't take that message away. But I think there is some areas of the curriculum where it's just somewhat easier to do.
Thank you. And Dave, what about certain types of assessments, not necessarily within subject areas, but actual maybe types of assessment? Are there some assessments that students generally find easier to cope with than others?
When it comes to test anxiety, assessments that rely, or assessments that make heavy cognitive load demands of students are generally less well liked by highly test anxious students. I mean, one of the effects of test anxiety is that it, you know, reduces information processing capacity, it reduces cognitive capacity. You know, we've all only got a finite amount of information processing capacity, and ideally what you want a student to do is, in an exam situation, have all of that focused on, you know, the exam. Anxiety eats into that by focusing it on worries and anxieties. So when you've got an exam that requires heavy cognitive load, and what we mean by cognitive load is where you've got to try and hold maybe 2 or 3 things in mind simultaneously in order to arrive at a conclusion, or you need to hold step 1 in the mind in order to do step 2, and then step 2 in the mind to do step 3, and then go back to step 1. You know, a lot of thinking basically. And exams that and assessments that typically make those demands of students are those involved in maths and STEM-related subjects, science and technology-related subjects. So they're generally less well liked by highly test-anxious students. But I mean, having said that, it is fairly even across the board. And certainly in the UK, at the point where we used to have exams and coursework, and I don't know if this is still the case internationally, you know, the issue is not solved by just replacing exams with coursework, because coursework, of course, makes lots of time demands of students as well. And, you know, you end up with a juggling act. A student has to juggle, I need to prioritize this subject and this subject and this subject and this subject. And it's not necessarily an easy answer saying we'll just replace the exams with coursework and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And from our perspective, we need to look at standards and fairness and making sure that people are examined in the correct and most appropriate sort of way as well. So we can't just suddenly flip from one type of exam to another, for example, but we still need to be conscious of how people are affected by them.
Following on from that, and you've both talked a bit earlier about measuring well-being. I think Ros, in your presentation, you talked about the student voice. David, you mentioned about kind of assessing for test anxiety. So just thinking about that, so would you recommend doing a baseline? And then would you also recommend then maybe looking at a way of measuring the impact of any interventions that you might put in place? David, should we come to you first for that one?
Yeah, you know, there's various ways in which you can assess the impact of intervention. I mean, I would always encourage people to assess the impact of intervention, because you need to know if what you're doing is effective or not, and if it's effective for whom, more or less effective, and so on. And, you know, you can do this in more or less complex ways. A really simple way, you know, if we're talking about test anxiety, you could just ask people to rate on a scale of 0 to 10, you know, 10, I'm super test anxious, 5, I'm a little bit test anxious, 0, I'm not test anxious at all. And you could ask people to compare those before and after doing an intervention. Something I've tried with the intervention we do in the UK is asking students to write a letter to themselves, an anonymous letter that is, after they've done an intervention, saying what they learnt and what they'd have told themselves beforehand if they'd have known what they know now. And some of those can be incredibly instructive in accessing what, you know, Ros has talked about already, the student voice, you know, really what they're thinking and feeling. Or you can use a more standardized measure. You can take a standardized measure of test anxiety, you know, an established validated measure, and you could do a baseline, as you said, and then you could complete it again afterwards to see if that test anxiety is reduced pre to post intervention. Either of those approaches, you know, you can use more or less complex ones, but as long as you use something, I think that's a good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think what's the important thing is, what are you going to do with it? Because it doesn't want to become another stick to beat the student or school up about. So you need to think carefully about what message you're sending with this. So I think it is something that has to be a collaborative. We're doing this together to work out what the issues are that we want to do something with, and then we're going to see how that's helped, with a view to empowering people. If it becomes something that's imposed, that, you know, becomes a black box and no one knows quite what's going to happen to this becomes a performativity measure, which I think can completely undermine what you're trying to achieve. So you've got to be careful. So if it's done for the right reasons, it's a really good idea. But if it's done for the wrong reasons, it can become just another thing that's problematic.
So if you're asking a question, sorry, go ahead, Sian.
I'll add on something to what Ros has said there, because I think you highlighted something really important there, Ros, which is it's not imposed on students. So I think particularly when we're talking about adolescent students, you know, part of what adolescence means, and, you know, there will be slight differences to this in different countries and different cultural systems, but part of what being an adolescent means is becoming an adult and taking on adult responsibility. And the other flip side of that is that it's important for adolescents to feel they are being genuinely listened to by adults, and also that they are given some increasing sense of independence and autonomy from adults as well. And one of the critical determinants of interventions with adolescents is the extent to which they can choose to participate in it, or the extent to which it's imposed on them. And generally what you find is that interventions that are imposed on adolescents are much, much, much less effective than interventions which are freely chosen So I'd really encourage, people, if you are going to try some intervention, really make clear to students that it's something that they can choose to participate in if they want to, but it's not something that they have to do. And there will always be some who decide not to. But you'll get a much, much, much better outcome and buy-in from those that have chosen to do it if they've been given the autonomy and freedom to choose.
Thank you. We're going to move over to questions from the audience now, and thank you to everybody who's asked a question. I can see on my count here 71 questions have come in, so I'm not sure we're going to get quite through every single individual one, so apologies in advance if we don't manage to do that. What we'll try to do, though, is we'll try to group them as best we can, and scrolling through them, I can see we have answered some of them already anyway, so I hope you've already found the answers, you've been listening. And we're going to start with ones actually around the pandemic, inevitably. We tried deliberately not to talk about that too much in the first half because we wanted to make sure that people understand this is not just about the times of the pandemic. The whole idea about social and emotional well-being and mental health is an ongoing thing. It's not just for the here and now. So we will turn to the pandemic now, however. And what things have you noticed? You've mentioned some statistics already, potentially, that are showing that children are getting more anxious in various ways. But have you got almost a brief summary of what you've seen that you think might be important for us to take into the future as schools do return to at least some degree of normality? Has anything really stood out for you that you've seen in your reading or in case studies or any conversations you've had with schools around the world on this? Ros, could I start with you?
Yes, I mean, I think young people are going to come back to school having, not seen their friends in person for quite a long time in the classroom. And there is sort of a loss there that needs to be made up. So I think it's very important for schools that, although there is obviously a learning loss in academic terms, we won't overcome that if we're not also attending to the social and emotional learning loss as well. So this, I think, is an important thing for schools to think about and prioritise as well, because I think there will be a lot of pressure on schools to catch up because they've missed curriculum time because of, online learning in some ways being less sufficient. But we must attend to that too. I think it's also worth pointing out, whilst we talked about statistics which are showing overall that young people have been disadvantaged in emotional, social and emotional terms, there are some groups actually who have benefited from the pandemic. So there's some youngsters who find school very difficult and threatening environments and have actually welcomed the opportunity to learn remotely from home. So, those youngsters will be particularly apprehensive about returning to in-person situation. People get bullied. I mean, I know cyberbullying will happen anyway, but there are things that we need to think about, I think, as students, young people return.
Thank you. David?
Well, I'm going to pick up on that point, Ros, because maybe just narrow it down into exams a little bit, because it's my main focus. You're right. Some people the pandemic has been beneficial for, and others it's been less beneficial for. So one of the most interesting things I thought about students' response to the pandemic was the differences in the responses they had. So especially when the pandemic first broke, and obviously governments had to move very quickly. And many countries, like they did in the UK, just cancelled examinations. Is that just, how relieved some students were that they didn't have to take their exams. And some actually reported feeling grateful to their respective governments for having relieved them for what is then an intensely anxiety-provoking experience. I think it's really important we don't underplay, for those students who are test anxious, just how unpleasant it is. And so the feeling of having a weight lifted, of being freed from that experience, even though, certainly what happened in the UK that followed, students weren't very necessarily pleased with the way in which the grades were estimated, but the actual having the pressure of that actual exam situation taken away was good for some. Other students showed exactly the opposite reaction. This is something I've been working towards for, some were saying 5 years. you know, I put in all of this effort and now it's just been taken away from me. Now I feel like I can't demonstrate my effort. What's it all been for? And so on and so on. So what I think we're seeing with the pandemic is a microcosm of what's going on all the time. And we've had a light shine on it. And I think what I'd really like to see moving forward is that we don't forget that when we return to normal, we don't just imagine all of this stuff has gone away, because it's not. That's going on all the time. It's just that the pandemic has enabled it to come to the fore. And it's exactly the same, I think, with the mental health issues, with the well-being issues. This was all going on already. It's just brought a spotlight onto it. So let's not imagine all of those issues are going to go away just because the pandemic has gone away. Although we've been told that's never going to go away. We have to live with it. That's a different question on its own, isn't it?
It is.
Just going over to one of the other questions that's come up now, which is really interesting. And I think, Ros, you did speak about this in your presentation as well, but it's around helping teachers to overcome stress, and what can school leaders do to help their teachers?
Yes, I mean, as I said in the presentation, there is actually quite a strong evidence base connecting teacher and student wellbeing. And we need to think of our schools as a community. We have learners, but we have teachers and other members of staff and the broader community that are all part of what's happening here. So we need to look after that whole community for it to work as a micro system very effectively. There's an interesting website, which I might just flag up to you now, if you will indulge me. It's called educationsupport.org.uk. There's loads of very interesting resources on this site that are about supporting teachers, not only from the perspective of teachers themselves, but also as senior leaders to support teachers. So that might be worth looking at if you're interested in following it up.
Thank you for that. David, anything to add to that?
$1 million question, isn't it? How do you solve teacher stress? It's not only students that are under pressure to perform, teachers are under pressure to perform as well. And in countries that have got quite enhanced accountability systems, so teachers and schools being judged on their students' performance, it gets even ramped up even more. And, you know, when I was talking about the type of, you know, positive and negative and long-term and short-term stress before, teachers are going to be much more at the sharp end of chronic stress, much more at the sharp end of burnout, much more at the sharp end of exhaustion. And I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but interventions can only achieve so much. Personalised interventions can only achieve so much in a system that promotes chronic stress and burnout. I think there needs to be much more pushback against education systems and the authorities who regulate education systems to recognise this point and not keep individualising and personalising the issue of teacher stress. I mean, I'll just give you an example that is UK specific, but you might be able to identify with this in your own context, is that in the United Kingdom, sorry, I should be more specific, in England specifically, about 4 years ago, in England, we have a big problem with teacher retention. A lot of teachers leave the teaching profession after 5 years, and they cite stress as being one of the major reasons in which they leave the profession. And the government started accusing universities of choosing the wrong students to train to be as teachers, you know, i.e. People who weren't resilient enough, or people who were, what's the word we use in England? Snowflake generation, you know, it's like, oh, I can't cope with it, and so on and so on. You've got to stop treating it as an individual issue, and you've got to recognise that it is a sector-wide issue. Sure, there are always going to be some people who are more prone to it and less to it, but when you've got large numbers of people who desperately want to stay as teachers, but who simply cannot endure this continuing pressure and continuing chronic stress over a long period of time, I'm sorry, the governments have got to wake up and take this issue seriously and look what they can do about workload and accountability pressures. Sorry, there was a little bit of a soapbox moment there.
Thank you for your answers to that. I mean, just thinking about as well with, is there anything that kind of school leaders can do about a culture, creating a culture within their school to help with teacher well-being? I mean, for example, I was reading something, I was reading an article the other day, and they were talking about, you know, if school leaders can kind of set an example, so to speak, you know, if they leave on time, then it kind of almost gives permission for staff to leave on time. Is there anything else, any advice you could give around that for school leaders?
Well, just drawing on this same resource I mentioned a moment ago, there's, as I said, various resources on here, including 4 R's. So recognise, take a moment each day to identify the elements of the work that's giving you the stress. Rest and recoup, take at least 20 minutes each day to incorporate calm moments into your routine. Relationships, talk about your worries, and recreation. So, I mean, again, these are quite straightforward messages, but I think if senior, as you say, if senior leaders model this too and talk openly about the issues and don't try and sweep it under the carpet, and say, look, what can we do as an institution to do something about this? Do we really need to do this? You know, there's a lot of form filling, I think, that goes on in institutions, because there's a sense of we've always done it that way. And actually, when you look at it, you think, well, why are we doing this? It's not something the government is ever going to ask us for. We can, you know, we have better ways of monitoring or understanding the progress of our young people. So it's actually about stopping and saying, you know, we've always done it like this, but do we need to now? What can we, it's not a question of what we need to do more of, it's what can we do less of, and what can we do more efficiently. But that message has to come from the senior leader, and I appreciate it's particularly difficult if your school's under a lot of pressure to produce academic results, or has been, you know, in a situation where you've been told you need to improve yourselves. But in those contexts, even more so, I think it's really important.
Thank you.
What ways can schools help parents in their understanding as well? Because again, going back to the idea of people having different attitudes to mental health, to well-being, to stress and anxiety, there are some people who might say, for example, I'm not saying that all parents do this or that all adults do this, they might say things like, pull yourself together, or man up, or even things like, you're crying like a little girl, which is a terrible thing that you hear from time to time, or just simply grow up. How can schools help parents, or indeed other stakeholders around the school, understand more about the kind of issues that we're talking about here today?
Shall I start us on that?
It's
a big question, isn't it? And yes, you may find there are generational differences in understandings around these things. And I think, I mean, certainly as a university academic, I'm seeing more of my students arriving using the word self-care, for instance, which would not have been heard, I don't think, 10, 15 years ago. So I think we have to empower young people, but we also have to empower parents. So I suppose as a community, it would be about inviting parents in to discuss these issues, normalising that this is just an equally important part of education. You know, it should be a goal of education to promote well-being and mental wellness, and using this language and educating the community gradually that, you know, this is not the snowflake fluffy thing. This is really important. And some of the statistics that I know Dave also shared in his presentation, you know, these are things that we can show parents and others in our educational communities too, so they understand that this is not a sort of side thing that isn't important. In my view, this is what schooling is about. You know, we're educating people as future citizens to be productive in our economies. They won't be productive if they're going to struggle and have lots of mental health issues and, you know, have time away from work and so forth. So it's absolutely crucial to us as humans. What do we want our society to be? Sorry, that's my soapbox now, so I'll pass on to Dave.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back in some way to the point we made earlier about, you know, teachers knowing their students most effectively, and when to put pressure on and when to take pressure off. And it's exactly the same for parents. You know, parents want the best thing for their children. And the best thing for some child might be to encourage them, you know, motivation wise. And sometimes that might be harsh. And sometimes it's the time to take pressure off and, you know, tell your child to take a break, schedule some enjoyable activities for them, whether they want to do them with the family or with their friends, you know, and it's just about, yeah, knowing when to prioritize to push the academic side and when to prioritize taking a break from the academic side. And, you know, there simply is no substitute for, you know, knowing your child the best you can and talking to your child. When it comes to anxiety or test anxiety specifically, a specific concern for many, many test anxious students, not all of them, but many, is that unless they get a particular profile of grades, and it might be top grades and everything, or it might just be passes and everything, they're really worried their parents aren't going to think highly of them. You know, they're going to think, if I don't get, you know, meet my parents' expectations, yeah, they're not, you know, they're going to judge me negatively. And quite often there's an element of, you know, what psychologists are called mind reading here, because they haven't actually asked their parents this. And it might take an awful lot of guts to ask your parents this, because it's the one thing that you're scared of. So what you can do as a parent is tell your child, it doesn't matter. You're going to be loved anyway. Make sure that they know, of course we want the best for you, but our love for you is unconditional. And that's one of the best things they can ever hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, we just had an interesting question here as well about how can teachers create a safe and healthy environment for students? So of course, you know, the environment is a very important part of well-being as well. So what can teachers do around that area? Ros?
Yeah, so this is about, I mean, safety is about having routines that students understand, having people you can talk to. Many schools have someone who's has a counselling background, or yeah, someone from that sort of domain. Having that person central in the school that they know they can talk to. I think all of these sorts of things help. So it's around students understanding and the whole community understanding, you know, what's expected, how things happen, what would happen if things don't happen. So there's sort of the safety in those routines, but also having the space and opportunity to open up and discuss things. So, I mean, those little, I mean, I used to teach, and those corridor conversations before the lesson started often were the most powerful thing in young people's day. You know, you sort of get a sense of where they're at, and just one or two little words can make all the difference to a young person. So I think it comes, for me, it comes down to relationships, really.
David?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to match your approach to what's appropriate for the students and the school and the expectation. Before I became an academic, I worked for 12 years as a secondary school teacher, and you know, some things that worked in some schools, for instance, meeting students at the door to the classroom and welcoming them in, wouldn't have worked in other schools at all. So, you know, I think you've got to match it up. But I always think a positive classroom environment boils down to three things, which is, number one, having a structure and students knowing what the expectations are of them within that classroom, and what's going to happen if they don't meet those expectations. And that's got to be very clearly made to students. It's got to be very clearly communicated to students, and it's got to be enacted consistently, absolutely consistently. The second point is the one that Ross has alluded to already, is relationships within that classroom. You have to build positive, trusting relationships, and you do that through building a rapport with students. Sure, not every student is going to like you, and you're not going to like every student, but nonetheless, you have to afford students a degree of respect. You have to afford students a degree of autonomy where appropriate to do so. You know, basically treat them like human beings. And the other one is the instructional approach. So you need to adopt an instructional approach, and we have an idiom in England that says, you know, teaching your grandmother how to suck eggs. So I'm not going to tell teachers how to teach, but, you know, having an instructional approach which matches challenge level of the student with the material that's being taught. So students have to know it's something that's within their grasp to be able to do if they try hard. And I think if you get those three things right, the classroom structure, the classroom relationships, and the instructional approach, you're going to be setting yourself up to have a really good, strong, positive classroom environment.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two very quick questions. So brief answer on these if you wouldn't mind. There's lots of questions that are coming from the chats too with online learning. And just to say to everybody who's watching, we did a conference in April, which is specifically about online learning. So you may want to watch the recordings back on that you can access on our website. So my colleagues could put the link in the comments for if you want to access Dr. Rhonda Bondi's conversation about this as well. But the question that I have here, which seems to have come up a number of times, is students would have spent a lot of time on screen. How might that affect their attitudes, their health, their well-being, and indeed their anxiety as well when it comes towards taking tests? So Rosa, I'll start with you about kind of general terms about screen time. What might that do to them if indeed we've got any conclusion on that yet? And then over to you, David, to talk a bit more about anxieties around taking tests or not taking, or indeed being observed, almost like remote proctoring perhaps, for example, online.
I know, I mean, this isn't my area of research, but I do know there's quite a lot of research on sort of screen time use. And, you know, it was uniformly thought to be negative on well-being. You know, one of the questions often asked on the well-being questionnaire is, do you spend more than 3 hours a day on the screen? But I know it's much more nuanced than that. So it depends on what they're doing on the screen, I think, is what it comes down to, and whether that's harmful or not. I'm afraid I'm not on top of the literature in that area to be able to give a definitive answer, but I think we do need to sort of go beyond that, is it on screen or not? I think it's about how active the usage is, how much autonomy and how much real engagement you have. And some of that can be extremely positive. So I don't think it's a uniformly negative thing. But clearly, once we translate back into the classroom, the effects of having done that for over a year need to be thought about.
Thank you. I guess it might also depend on the attitude of the researcher to some extent, albeit the researchers, of course, tried to be objective in their research, absolutely. But just thinking about an adult's perception of how children are these days, children who are online a lot all of the time, they may have a very different perception than we do in our conclusions of how things are. But no, I'll hand over to you, David, because you'll know much more than I do on this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what the evidence that is coming out seems to show as far as test anxiety goes is, in fact, face-to-face versus online has had less impact than you might imagine. And I've been thinking about this as to the reason why, and, you know, based on the sort of little evidence that we have, actually, it seems to be because it's, or in both cases, driven by fear of failure. And fear of failure is fear of failure, whether it's online or whether it's, you know, sort of face-to-face written test in person. You know, there are obviously different characteristics of online versus face-to-face. For instance, in face-to-face settings, many students find it unsettling, the presence of an invigilator walking around. Many students, highly test anxious students in large exam settings, get the feeling that everyone else is writing away and they're just freezing up, they can't think. And both of those aspects are going to be lessened to some degree online. However, at the same time, highly test anxious students can often find it very reassuring when they've got a teacher that they know that is present either just before they go in, or that, you know, just, you know, gives them a, you know, a little encouraging word and so on. So they're not going to be present online as well. So, you know, there's pros and cons, but the driving factor behind students getting anxious is going to be the same, whether it's online or whether it's face-to-face, which is that students are fearing failing, however that failure is defined. You know, some students failing is an actual fail grade, for some students failing is not getting the top grade. It's all, you know, subjectively defined by the student themselves.
Thank you. So there's lots of things for us to watch out for, but I think also many positive things that we can do to intervene at various stages in education. And as you've both been saying, it's so important to put emotional health and well-being alongside the academic part of things. We should focus on both, not independently, not separate from each other, but is part and parcel of education. So thank you so much for those answers to the questions, and thank you to everybody who has asked us questions. Sorry we couldn't ask every single one of them, but I hope we've done a good service in trying to generalize many of the questions that were coming through. It's hard to keep up because by the end there were 96 questions, so apologies if we couldn't answer every single bit and piece of those, but you can listen back to the recording, you can listen back to the presentations as well, and hopefully your answers will be in and amongst those, and as I say, also from the other presentations that we've given in other online conferences. So we have reached the end of the session, so I want to thank you, all of you who have interacted, whether or not you've asked questions, whether you just simply like things, or simply if you've been listening in. We hope you found the answers useful for your contexts, and that you've now got clear ideas about how best you can support learners' emotional health and well-being in your schools. So I'd like to thank very much Dr. Ros McClellan. Thank you, Ros. And also Professor David Putwain for being such engaging speakers and for such a stimulating conversation as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and again for doing the presentations. We've only scratched the surface of everything here. I think we'll all agree, and there's much more we could talk about. I would suggest there's plenty of research here, and don't know whether either of you are looking for more PhD students, but you may have some listening in who would be quite keen to do things in their areas as well. So I'd encourage all of you to have a much closer look at what Ros and David have been doing, and what their colleagues have been doing as well, and indeed people in other institutions working on this, because there's plenty to read up on this. It's a really big area and only growing, I would say, as well. So yeah, do get in contact with people such as Ros or David who are working in this area and see if you can interact in various ways. Let's say thank you as well to colleagues behind the scenes. That's James, Charlotte, and Kate, and thanks also to Julie for asking the questions alongside me. So thank you to you all. We can do it without you behind the scenes, but in particular. And Julie, do you want to talk about the resources we have as well?
Yeah, definitely. So if you would like to know more about what we're doing at Cambridge International to support schools, here are some resources that you might like to explore. So firstly, you can see there on the screen, we've recently published a brand new education brief on learner wellbeing. This was actually written by one of Ros's doctoral students, Tanya Clark, and this is available in Spanish and Portuguese as well as in English. Secondly, we've also created a section on our website, and this is dedicated to mental health and well-being during the pandemic. So if you have a look on there, you can find more webinars and tips and lists of resources. And I think my colleagues are going to be putting the links to those in the comments box as well. And also as well, just please do look out, because we are always working on further resources in this area. So there may be other professional development opportunities around learner and teacher wellbeing coming soon. The other thing I've just been asked to say as well is that we will be sharing the recording of this early next week, and we won't be providing a certificate of attendance for the conference.
Thank you, Julie. And you can continue to listen to this recording as many times as you want to. You can stop and start it. You can share it with your colleagues as well. More than welcome. Please spread it around the world, and let's have lots of people tuning in and understanding the issues that we've been talking about today. So we hope that you're going to join us for some more of the workshops and another panel discussion with teachers next week related to this topic within this conference as well. So it's next week if you're watching this live. If you're watching a recording, you can also watch recordings of all of those later on. So we've got more on test anxiety next week, more research into this area, which we've done particularly within Cambridge International, more on the inclusive classroom or inclusive education, and something as well about trying to survey students and work out their personalities and what might make them feel good or not so good about education at various points. So until then, thanks everybody for tuning in again. Take care and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.